There we go. Whoa, I'm so loud. This is amazing. All right, guys. So it's the afternoon of the second day, and it's warm in the room. So I will try to do two things in today's presentation. I will try to be a little bit funny and a lot crazy. And I'm much better at being one of those things than the other. I'll let you decide which one it is. So look, my name is Stas Gayshin. I'm from the Cambridge Innovation Center. And we're talking about innovation. And I like reading my slides. So I'm going to read this one because I think it's important. The reason we are here in this particular room right now is to talk about two subjects that are very near and dear to my heart. One is building innovation communities, and the second is the Boston innovation ecosystem. So I will tell you that I was not born in Boston. I actually was born in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. And I came to the US as a little kid. And so I love Boston the way an immigrant loves a place, not the way somebody who was born there loves it. So you're gonna hear me talk about my true love, innovation communities, and my second true love, Boston. So a little bit of an overview about CIC, the Cambridge Innovation Center. So I'm a managing director at the Cambridge Innovation Center, and what you should know about CIC is our job in the world is to build innovation communities. And we do this because we are trying to create a supportive ecosystem for impactful entrepreneurs to fix the world. And what this slide doesn't say, what I'm going to tell you anyway, is that we think these are the only people who can. We think the world is broken, we think the world needs to be fixed, and we think it's only entrepreneurs who are able to do it. So our goal is to give as much capacity and as many tools to those entrepreneurs to make the world a better place. And to do that in a strategic way all around the world. We're currently in 7 cities around the world on 3 continents. And our goal is to be in 50. And so part of my reason why I said yes to coming back to Seoul, this is my second trip to Seoul and the second trip this year to Seoul, and also my second trip ever to Seoul. So I'm really excited to look at the innovation ecosystem here. But I'll tell you a couple of things about who we are and what we believe. So we really think that innovation is driven by the entrepreneur. So we think that the entrepreneur is an amazing, super crazy person who is able to do things that other people can't do, and that concentrating these impactful entrepreneurs in a single physical place creates outcomes that are otherwise impossible. We think that something magical happens when you put people together physically, and that this is the reason why people have moved from living on farms to living in cities, to making the cities bigger, to making the cities taller, because something magical happens when we are together in cities. So where we are so far, we're open in Cambridge, and it's time to update the slide because we are building hubs in 7 cities, with a few more under construction, and we're gonna be in 50 cities before it's all done. I know you're looking at this picture and thinking, what the hell? What is this? So this is how venture capital got started. It's not an often told story, but I think it's a very fascinating one. So what you're looking at, the big black object in the center of this picture with the big fountain of water coming from it, if you haven't recognized that, that's a whale. And in the 1800s, Boston was known as a big center for global whaling. So people came to Boston to hunt whales. And it turns out that whaling is a lot like venture capital. And in fact, early stage venture capital firms built a lot of their modern financial structures on looking at operations that were done in the 1800s for whaling. So it turns out that whaling, as it was done in the 1800s, was incredibly profitable. However, 2/3 of the ships that went out to go catch a whale didn't catch one at all. So only 1/3 of the ships came back. And tell me when this sounds familiar. A lot like venture capital, many companies fail. In the journey, people got hurt because whaling is extremely dangerous. And many of the ships never came back at all. And of the ships that came back with whales, many people were hurt. And so lots and lots of money had to be dedicated to this venture in order to keep it financially successful. On the other hand, because of its enormous profit potential, it made sense to spread the risk out among a number of ventures,
for people who were involved in the enterprise to protect and connect to one another in the ecosystem and to build a sharing, supportive environment that allowed these folks to do this successfully. So here's an interesting fact for folks who follow financially. According to some estimates, in over a 30-year period, the ventures that were involved in whaling had a 14% annual return on investment over 30 years. This is more impressive than the US stock market in the 20th century. It's really an absolutely incredible number, and it was done because of risk sharing, risk pooling, and connections between the people you see right there. Look at how small these boats are, and compared to the whale they're trying to get. And yet, these folks are taking on an impossible challenge. And I think that, although I think whaling is really brutal and it shouldn't be done today, I think this symbolizes a lot of the early thinking about how do we transform ventures. And in fact, the early venture capitalists looked at the financial models for whaling as they built their enterprises. So I want to start this talk by talking to you a little bit about the Boston innovation ecosystem, and then we'll come back and talk about how we think about innovation at large. So there's one thing I didn't put in here in the slide, and I'll tell you a lot about why you should care about Boston. I'll tell you one thing that doesn't exist in the slide, and 100% this is not because I forgot to include it. That's not why. It's because I want to make sure that the cost of this flight stays cheap, but we do not have a direct flight that leaves from Seoul and lands in Boston. I think it's a pretty significant distance, so it takes a little bit of time, but you don't have to connect anywhere. You can go straight from here, and you can get out and have a lobster by the ocean. So please come to Boston and visit. So looking for a second at the data, and I think there's a very, very interesting bit. So this data comes from Harvard Business School and the US Commerce Department. They have analyzed clusters and thinking about how do cities perform. And if you look at the clusters in Boston, the biggest three clusters are business services. And by the way, I just want to give you one specific note about this chart. When they do this analysis, they separate clusters into what they call traded clusters and local clusters. And the way to think about this, and if you go to clustermapping.us, you can actually see the original source data for this. It's a very, very interesting project because when you look at economic development of a city, you can look at what are the business that people are doing with one another in that city, and what is a business that they're doing with the rest of the world. And so the local is local and the traded is global. So this is Boston's traded business. So what does Boston do for the rest of the world, which I think is a fundamental question that we're all trying to answer. So the largest employer in the city of Boston and in the metropolitan area is what's called business services. So this is consulting and work created to promoting business. Education and knowledge creation. Boston has a number of universities, more than 60, so education's a big business. And then the other is distribution and electronic commerce. And so this is another big sphere. We actually have a number of companies that work in the digital space. So, and then the one after that is financial services and so on and so forth, and it gets smaller. But financial services is another really interesting one. Boston is probably the preeminent city around the world that works on a product called a mutual fund. So folks, if you don't follow financial services closely, mutual funds are the pension and retirement funds that many of us have for different employees and from different employers and for different employees. And that those funds are driven by large companies that help institutions like endowments, governments, and pension funds organize that money. A lot of that business is driven from Boston. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through further slides. So understanding the cluster portfolio in Boston in the innovation ecosystem, it's useful to look at the industries. And the reason it's useful to look at this is as you're thinking about, hey, I want to build my company globally, how do I connect from the ecosystem in Seoul to an ecosystem in the US? I think the broad question you should ask is, what is a city that allows me to take my business and connect it to a strong, already existing cluster? Because that kind of support will help you in figuring out which city to go through. When the conference asked me to come speak, this was a thing that the folks wanted me to focus on, is thinking about when you're coming to Boston, what is it that you want to do? So if you look at this, is a very interesting chart because although it's the most recent available data, because it's 2016, one of the things that's missing quite a bit is the growth in biopharma. So if you were to make this chart for 2019, there are about 10,000 more jobs in pharma. And so pharma would be about the size of aerospace and defense, and maybe a little bit bigger. And somewhere closer to the IT industry than others. We have an enormous pharma industry today. 20 years ago, 3 of the 20 largest life sciences companies in the world had a presence in Boston. Today, it's all 20 of the 20. So I want to walk you through a little bit about the clusters. These are clusters as I've defined them. And note that the financial services and insurance groups actually kind of blend into one another. And I did this on purpose because in some ways, insurance companies are actually financial services companies. The insurance funds that you see here are some of the largest owners of real estate and some of the largest investors that exist in many industries. One way to think about this is, who are the companies that are potential acquirers of my product? Who are the potential partners for me to work with? Who are the companies that might give me an insight and give me an opportunity to come say hello? This is a very, very interesting group. I tried a little bit here to make the size of the logo roughly connected to the size of the company, although it's a bit tricky because if it was really to scale, Bank of America and Dell would be some of the biggest things on this page, and John Hancock would take over the whole page completely. So, as would State Street. So within that realm, it's useful to point out a couple of interesting stories here. So HubSpot, up in the upper left corner, is a company that actually is very familiar to us at CAC because it started at CAC. So we are a shared space for startups. Today in Boston, in Cambridge, we have 4 buildings that have more than 1,000 companies across them, representing people working across every industry and more than 4,000 people in total. What's really interesting is when HubSpot came in, its founders were serial entrepreneurs, much like many of our other clients. And they just had a crazy idea. And then it grew, and then it grew, and then it grew. And HubSpot is a marketing automation company, so it's very focused on B2B world. And HubSpot and Akamai, for me, are 2 companies that really framed the Boston story quite successfully. So I know, let's ask this question of the room. Who here, one, has heard of Akamai? All right, excellent. Of the people who just raised their hands, how many of you know what Akamai does? All right, awesome. So that's about right. Akamai is a fascinating company because a few years ago, they carried as much as 70% of all traffic on the internet. And so all of us, the smartphone you have in your device, more than half the apps on that phone probably use some sort of Akamai product to get data. Their problem that they're dealing with is a very fascinating one. And the problem is, this is a very particular Boston approach to solving the problem. Light is not fast enough. So actually, if you're trying to get data to go from one side of the world to another side of the world, think about it this way. Let's say you're surfing Facebook. So you're based here in Seoul, I live in Boston. You add me as a friend, and you want to look at my profile. Where is the data in my profile stored? Is it stored near you in Seoul? If so, then as the data travels to Boston, it gets slowed down. And so when you're using the app in Boston, it's slow. Or is my data stored in Boston, which means when you try to add me, my pictures aren't loading. You're trying to look through my profile, and you're saying, why can't this profile picture load? It's a really interesting problem. And it turns out that when you send light through switches and the earth, it doesn't move as quickly as it does in a vacuum. And so you have to think about, where is the data globally? If you want to have your apps and your digital data responsive to you, you have to think about where in the world it lives. And that's what Akamai thinks about. And it's a type of business that now exists. It's pretty, there are a few companies in that industry, but they're the first content delivery network, the first people to think about, hey, that content that you're consuming, where's it coming from? Right? How does it get there? What is the speed with which it gets redistributed? So it's an interesting company in that way. And then there are a number of these other companies. I'm sure many of you know Analog Devices. If you look at software and hardware information technology, I didn't even really know how to describe them, but Desktop Metal, Formlabs, and Markforged are companies that are building 3D manufacturing devices. So primarily 3D printers, but I think at this point they're a little bit more complicated devices than that. So Boston is a big cluster of them. There are actually about 10 companies in the area that are working on various kinds of additive manufacturing. So that was the technology side. I want to walk you through another bit, which is Boston is well known as a life sciences hub. It is the world's largest life sciences research ecosystem. driven by life sciences on the pharma side. So that's just some of the pharmaceutical companies that are located in Boston. And for all of those companies, they're either headquartered in Boston, or they've headquartered their research in Boston, or they've moved their most significant research divisions into Boston. We have a big focus on energy and renewable tech. And then we have a smaller but very interesting focus on industrial chemistry. And I think it's very much tied to our history in life sciences, and then also in medical devices. So there are a bunch of companies that are building, large global public companies, that are building the kind of devices that you're using. So if you're working in life sciences from a pharmaceutical side, or life sciences from a medical device side, a lot of the folks you want to talk to, potentially partner with, and maybe have as your investors, maybe be bought from, are all located in Boston. And then I don't want to get too far away from this, because this is very interesting. So I put this company on here not only because it's run by a friend of mine, but also because I think they do something really cool. They've built a wind turbine that flies. So there are places in the world where you can't get a wind turbine mounted on land, but you still need power. So they've created a flying wind turbine that actually sends power to the ground through an attached cable. And I just think as an idea, it's a pretty cool one. So it makes your power mobile in a way that maybe wasn't imaginable before. And then, one more thing is digital lumens. So what I love about working in the startup environment is there are people who are constantly thinking about how can we do a smaller, crazier, more interesting thing. Digital Lumens is a company that thinks about networked lighting. So can I push a button and have the lights in my factory turn on or off? That's the kind of thing that they're thinking about. It's hugely impactful. And there's other companies in Boston that are asking questions about, if the power is up, do I really need all my lights? Imagine if your power company said to you, hey, listen, our power grid is currently very taxed. What if we pay you to turn off some of your lights? How do you do that? And there are companies in Boston that are working on that problem as well. So one more thing, which I think is interesting. Boston is a massive robotics cluster. And the robotics cluster started with iRobot. In many ways, there were robotics companies before, but it was iRobot that really made it real. iRobot is the company that made the first vacuum that moved around your house. They have a fascinating story. Their business, they also built the Mars lander for NASA using some of the same logic. And when the United States went to war in Iraq, they built a soldier safety system where they built this robot that soldiers would throw into a house through a window, and it would run around the house, and it would try to trigger any bombs that would be set in the house in order to not have soldiers be hurt, because the thinking was, let's blow up a robot and let's keep the person alive. So the very first Roomba, the vacuum that kind of moved around your house and bounced into all the walls and didn't really do a lot of vacuuming, but really bounced around everywhere, that Roomba was using logic used for minesweeping, which was created by a robot in the Iraq War. And this is a very interesting part of the story, because I think it tells us a lot about the connections between groups like defense and robotics, where many of the technologies that get developed in the defense sector, like the internet itself, end up in the very unexpected applications in the consumer sector. I remember hearing the CEO of iRobot and the founder of the company talk about, if you had told him 20 years, it took them 20 years to come to a business model that actually made them consistent money. If you had told him 20 years before he started this company that he would be a vacuum cleaner salesman, when he was building his robotics company, he said, I'm not sure I would still be in the business. And yet here we are, and they're a massive player. And now what we've got is the descendants of that company have founded other companies. Amazon Robotics is, Amazon purchased a huge robotics company for $700 million to do warehouse automation. Because if you think about this, what those very smart, large companies are thinking of, and if you're building a startup, you should know this, because this is how you can think about whether you want to sell, build, grow, or be acquired. If you were thinking about this juncture, so Amazon, what is the number one threat to Amazon? Right? If you think about it, how could somebody build a company that would be better than Amazon is at being Amazon? So there's two ways. One is you attack their data center business, so Amazon Web Services, and the other is you build a more efficient warehouse. Because Amazon's entire business is built off of efficient warehouses. So they wanted to make sure that nobody could build a more efficient warehouse, and they bought a robotics company whose entire job was building warehouse robots. And they renamed it Amazon Robotics, and now all they do is build robots for Amazon. So that's almost it. Just one more interesting piece of the story. People don't often think about Boston as a shoe town, but it's actually the second largest shoe town in the United States. after Portland and the Portland area where Nike is. Boston is home to basically every shoe brand except for Nike. In either their global headquarters with New Balance and Converse, or their North American headquarters with Puma and Reebok, and also ASICS. So the ASICS Digital Lab is there, so if you're thinking about digital shoe production, it's an interesting bit of business. And also, obviously, folks, Bose, Amar Bose, the founder of Bose, was his whole life a professor at MIT of audio. Driving a lot of that ecosystem is our educational institutions. I think the old joke about universities is, how do you build a great university? You start a university and then you wait 400 years. So conveniently, the first university on this list, Harvard University, which is right there in the center, was founded in Boston almost 400 years ago. Some people might say it was founded in Cambridge, Mass, but really for the Boston ecosystem is full of massive educational institutions, so many I couldn't possibly fit them on this page. But I think what's worthwhile to look at is they're incredibly diverse. So Emerson College focuses on media. UMass is a public institution that's able to get people to afford what is otherwise a very expensive education. MIT, BU, Olin, Wentworth are schools of engineering. And I saw some very interesting data on MIT. So MIT did a study in 2015 that said, if MIT was an economy, it would be the alumni of MIT generate $1.9 trillion of annual sales, and it would be the 10th largest economy in the world if the alumni of MIT were a company, which is why we were founded just across the street. So the other bit, and I think this is, I was talking the first night of this year with some folks about whether analogs to these exist, and it sounds like they don't. This is a very particular thing that is specific to Boston, and actually a number of these, I only put 6 of them up here because I frankly ran out of space. So MITRE, in the upper left corner, was founded by the US government as a nonprofit with MIT research to look at how problems could get solved in the federal government, where the federal government pays money and MITRE comes up with the solutions. McGovern, Whitehead, Koch, and Broad are life sciences institutes that are non-educational institutions. They're private, not-for-profits, funded with hundreds of millions of dollars, specifically to organize genomics and other kinds of research. So Whitehead is generic, McGovern does brain, Koch is cancer, and Broad is genomics. And Draper, like MITRE, is a not-for-profit research lab. So when you look at these kind of institutions, they play a connection role, and this is a really critical point. We'll kind of dive into this when we talk about building an innovation ecosystem. But it is absolutely critical in an innovation ecosystem. In order, you have your corporates, you have your startups, you have your educational institutions. But how do ideas flow in between them? How do they connect? Creating that connecting tissue is very critically important, and these institutions play a very significant role in cross-fertilizing innovation. I heard a researcher talk at the Broad Institute. He said one of the things that made it very unique for him in Boston is he had the best job of his life at his previous occupation, and then he found an even better one. And to move from one job to another, he just had to go across the street because all the institutions are physically closely connected and proximate. So let's look for a second at the venture capital picture, because I think this is also another way of telling the Boston story. So when you look at a picture of the US and you want to understand where is the venture capital money going around the US, what you'll find is New England, which is basically the Boston and the surrounding area, mostly focused on Boston, counts for about 10% of the 2018 funding in the US. About 60% of the value, about 40% of the funding goes to the West Coast. And then you kind of have New York is about 15% of that, and then the places around, everything's pretty widely distributed. So if you want to go into a concentrated hub, depending on which industry you want to look at, what you really should look at is the Boston area, the New York area, and then the West Coast, and a couple of very specific places in the West Coast based on your industry. So this is, I know this is small, and I apologize for how small this is, but this is also another way of looking at the data. So the dark blue area up at the top is the rest of the United States. So it's responsible for about half the area. The light blue area down below is San Francisco. So if you look, San Francisco alone is accounting for something like maybe 18-19% of the venture capital, both deal flow and cash in the US. The black area is New York. Then this is Silicon Valley south of San Francisco. This area is Boston, and this is the rest of the US. So what you can take a look at is basically, the US is a massive country, but more than half of everything happening in the world of venture capital deals is happening in 4 regions. And 2 of the regions are connected. All right, one more thing. So in building these interconnected institutions, there are a lot of folks who are working on building accelerator and incubator spaces and shared space. I'm going to get a little bit more into defining this, but I want to point out a couple of very specific ones that have made a huge difference in the Boston ecosystem and that are great for connecting if you were ever thinking about coming to Boston. So one of them is CIC. So we're on this page, the oldest space on this page. CIC was founded 20 years ago in Cambridge as a shared space for folks who are coming out of MIT and wanted to build some startups. Today, there's more venture capital at CIC in Cambridge than there is in the United Kingdom as a country. And in part of that growth, we've helped a lot of these other folks get started. So Mass Challenge actually started within CIC many years ago. It is a not-for-profit accelerator, I think the world's largest not-for-profit accelerator for startups. You can apply and get in and get some free space in Boston, and also a lot of mentorship and free prizes, no equity, nothing. But in addition to the sort of open ones, folks have built a number of accelerators that are focused on specific market verticals, which have been incredibly successful. So over on the left, you see Greentown Labs. This is of good friends of ours, started a clean tech incubator, incredibly successful, about 50 companies at any given time. Learn Launch are folks who, because of Boston's strength in education, wanted to focus on the education economy. And so Learn Launch is an accelerator specifically focused on the problems that people run into in working in ed tech. DCU is one of our largest local banks, and they have opened up their own FinTech Innovation Center. And we host the FinTech Sandbox, which is a space for FinTech companies that's virtual and allows companies to get access to special data so that when they're looking at FinTech issues, they can play around with specific data that's real data that comes out of the financial world but is de-anonymized. And then Lab Central was a specific question that was asked 5 years ago, very specifically, and previously had been asked for the 10 years before that, which is, if you could build a shared space, could you build a shared space for the life sciences industry that would allow life sciences to get the same kind of ease of access that a startup entrepreneur gets by just coming into a normal shared space with a laptop? And the answer was yes, and that was Lab Central. It opened in 2014. It's a not-for-profit funded by the state of Massachusetts and co-created by CIC and a number of other folks from biolabs and other companies. It raised $10 million from the public sector and another $20 million from the private sector. So the largest pharmaceutical companies, the ones I showed you on the previous slide, they actually invested in Lab Central in order to help promote the life sciences ecosystem. In 2015, the largest initial public offering ever in life sciences happened at Lab Central. Since then, the organization has grown tremendously. So between CIC and Lab Central, there's now more than 60,000 square meters of particular space in the Boston-Cambridge ecosystem. And in 2016, Mass Robotics joined the larger family. This is a not-for-profit built on a similar model, but for robotics. So just focusing on these clusters. And then 2 years ago, MIT wanted to work on a very specific problem. So MIT was thinking about this. There's a very particular challenge that they had to deal with in the startup ecosystem, which is that it is much more financially advantageous. It's much easier, you get a much better return if you invest in a software startup than in a hardware startup. So then the question is, who's going to do fusion? Who's going to do energy? Who's going to build electric cars? So we're going to think, who's going to think about life sciences when you can make so much more money just building an app? And so MIT is doing groundbreaking research in these fields, and the research is not coming out, it's not being commercialized, because there's not enough investment coming out of the universities. So MIT said, look, we need to fix this ourselves. And they actually raised a fund and created the space, and we helped them build it. My colleague Alex was very heavily involved in the creation of the engine. And this is an MIT with a bunch of other funds got together and created the capacity for folks to create a physical space that can focus on very complicated hard problems. and fund them with a long time horizon, knowing that you can actually build the future of our world if you work on it hard enough and you fund it. So there's a company there working on fusion and other really, really hard problems, the ones that we really need solved for our society. So just before I go here, let me just get back for a second. So when you look at this, what this should tell you about Boston, and I'll say this in closing, is in addition to being a large-scale ecosystem, we are also a place where it's very easy to connect to lots of efforts for people who want to work with you, who want to make the world a better place, who have put their money where their mouth is, and who are very connected both on a corporate level and a startup level in changing the way our ecosystem functions. So if you're interested in connecting to anybody in Boston, I'll give you now my email address. It's just my first name, Stas, @cic.com. So you can take a look at that. Send me an email, ask me who you want to connect to, and I'll see what I can do to connect you to the right people in Boston. So even if you just have questions. So that's Boston in a nutshell. If you have questions, please send them in through Slido. I want to talk to you about what is really my favorite topic of all, and this is the topic of building innovation communities. But before that, I'm just going to take a drink of water because I've just been ranting for a half hour and I need a small, short break. Oh, that's really nice. You know, water's just so magical. All right, so building innovation communities. You're going to have a lot of questions. You had a question about a whale. Now you're going to ask me a question about Back to the Future. Why is Back to the Future on the screen? Okay, so before we get into a long and serious rant about how to build an innovation community, I want you to think about yourself. So I'm looking at the room. It's a younger room, so this might be hard. But go back in your mind to the year 2000 and think about of yourself in the year 2000. And imagine somebody comes to you in the year 2000 and they say, in 2019, an entrepreneur will have built a world-changing electric car company. What is this entrepreneur doing today in 2000? Does anyone know? So you know who I'm talking about. But do you know what that entrepreneur, the one who's built the world-changing car company in 2019 and has done some other things, do you know what that entrepreneur was doing in 2000 and 2001? Yeah, he was actually getting fired from PayPal. So he was getting fired from his fintech startup. So if you're talking to somebody and thinking about how can I be ready to build a world-changing company in some kind of sphere, it may be that getting fired from an entirely unrelated business was a good way to start. And I think it's useful for us to keep this example in mind because oftentimes people say, predict the future, tell me what's going to happen, what do I need to know about everything? And the answer is sometimes even the smartest of us have no idea, and that we really need to be humble about that and understand that sometimes it's quite difficult to understand the future, but we got to work on it. So as we're thinking about this, how do we go down Innovation Road? By the way, this is a real sign. If you've been on the campus of Macquarie University, this is a real place, Innovation Road, Macquarie University in Sydney. So I want to talk to you about a magic word. For me, this is a really critical word. I'm going to say it in a bit, but first I'm going to tease for a bit longer. So this is a word that I think very accurately describes what it is that we need as people and how we relate to one another in this world. And I can't talk to you about this word without asking a fundamental question. And this is the fundamental question, and it's asked by one of my favorite writers, Yuval Noah Harari, who is an Israeli sociologist, and he asks a fundamental question. What explains the rise of humans? Why did we as a species take over the earth? Why was it us, and why was it not our ape cousins? They're bigger than us, they're stronger than us, they can run up trees really quickly. I can kind of get near a tree, but I can't run up one. Why did we get to take over the world, and why not other species? What is it that makes us the species that was able to do that? So he postulates something which I think is an incredible idea and one with which I'm very, very, very in very strong agreement with. The idea is really simple. What makes humans the powerful species that was able to take over the world is our ability to do three things. Number one, it is to work together flexibly with unrelated individuals. It's just these three. Work together flexibly with unrelated individuals. We are the only, and with unrelated individuals in large numbers. This is something that only we can do. So across the animal kingdom, when you look around this, and this is Yuval's point, and I think it's brilliant, all of the things that we've changed around the world, for both good and for bad, were changed because we have flexible work between large groups of unrelated people. So I don't think I'm closely related to anyone in this room. That might be a surprise. If so, see me later and tell me. But yet here we are talking about how we can better work together. And so what is it that allows us to do this? We're not in a family group. And we're going to change the way we work together, because when you came into this room today, you didn't know what I was going to say, and yet here we are working on it anyway. So this is a particularly unique thing for humans. And so that magic word is collaboration. And when we do collaboration, we think about this very, very, very seriously when we think about building innovation infrastructure. And I want to get the words right here, because the words matter. So in our language, oftentimes these four words, shared office space, incubator, co-working space, and accelerator, get thrown around as if they're one thing. I just want to very quickly define them because they're different. So in our world, shared office space is you come in, the space is you and some other companies. I really, by the way, don't like that term, but that's another conversation for another time. Incubator is a place where you go with an idea or an early stage concept. You work through it. Generally, incubators invest in your enterprise and their physical spaces. Accelerator is a very close cousin of the incubator, but is generally unlike an incubator, which doesn't have to be timed. An accelerator is a program. It has a beginning and an end. And both incubators and accelerators, some have costs, some don't have costs, some are funded, some are not funded. Some provide revenue, some are physical, some are not physical. And then co-working space and shared office space are often used interchangeably, but shared office space could be for dentists. Co-working space is usually like a shared space focused on innovation, but with non-dedicated open flat spaces. So if we were going to make this room an office, this would be a co-working space because we don't have any offices, we're just all kind of sitting at desks. So we think about shared space as the word that describes the entire industry. And so when you look at the shared space numbers globally, this is a 2019 survey from DeskMag. They look at these numbers every year. I've just adjusted them. But as you're seeing, oftentimes people say, hey, look, we have so many more shared spaces now than we had before. Aren't we done? Like, isn't the market full? And if you look at this, what you're seeing actually is, for folks who know, like if you're thinking about the hockey stick curve, right? If you think about how the growth curve of a hockey stick, what you know is we're at the very bottom. And what's next is growth that looks straight up. So we're looking at, this is the number of members, 43,000 members in 2011, is getting close to 2 million members just 7 years later. This is just the beginning of a hockey stick, and we're going up. So this is the kind of growth that we're seeing. And the reason for this is because people love collaboration. People actually, it turns out, when people go to shared spaces and they work with one another, they like it more. So lots of shared spaces have been built. I talked a little bit about this on the previous page. This is Lab Central, a shared space for life sciences, where we thought about, hey, can we build a shared space for office? And then can we transfer that knowledge so that if you're a person like this, so if you're a researcher, this is one of the hardest things you can do. How do you transition from working in a lab to working in an environment that's like a lab, but where you haven't bought or managed all this equipment? The answer is usually you spend lots of time and lots of money to replicate what you had at your university, or you can just walk across the street, get started, do some research, and build your company. And that's what this is. And then this is a public initiative together with the city of Boston. We built a shared space for innovation. So how do we think about this? For us, and this is in no way connected to MIT, but actually we really think about that innovation happens at the intersection of money, ideas, and talent. And that this is something that we're trying to build, physical spaces where money from venture capitalists, talent from really competent, amazing people, and ideas generated by entrepreneurs connect startups and to give them the opportunity to get better. So these are just some of the companies that were born. I know they're very small. You've never heard of these guys or these guys or these guys or these guys. So our goal really is to concentrate the impactful entrepreneur, because we think that when you're building a startup, the best person to get advice from is the incredibly serious entrepreneur who's built a previous startup and has come back to build their next one. So this is CIC today. We have between CIC spaces and in our networks, we have 19 locations that are open in 10 cities. CICs are open in 7 of them, and we're building more as we speak. So we've got sites under development all around the world. Hopefully, we need to add some more dots in this area. Looking very not dotted. Anyway, there's a lot more growth to do there. So this is the way a CIC center operates. We really think about this as not a floor, not a space, not a building, but a campus dedicated towards innovation. So folks who are connecting innovation globally with, just as examples here, with China and France, universities, large corporate partners, nonprofits, public innovation, community partners, the city government, and venture funds. So this leads to amazing focus efforts. And we've been able to do focus in a number of different ways. As I mentioned, with the Life Sciences Hub, with Lab Central, the Robotics Hub with Mass Robotics. We've also looked at industry focus. So we've created a community for makers called Design Town. We have worked with a partner to build a community for food innovators. We have partnered with Impact Hub to work on one for social entrepreneurs. And also, and this is, for me, this is really an interesting bit. This is a bit about our future. So I have a secret I want to tell you. Some of you might know it. Every day we get a little bit older, all of us. And so aging is one thing that affects us all. And aging is a complicated thing because it's everything. It's how you live your whole life. And when we started looking in Japan, there was a company that approached this and said, look, we really want to know everything that's happening in the field of aging. We want to know what are the drugs, what are the devices, what is the software, what are the apps, what are the applications? How do we know everything that's going on? Can you tell us? Can you just tell us everything happening in every one of your startups? And we said, well, listen, just in Boston, we have over 1,000 startups. So I don't think so. I think it would be pretty hard to tell you what each one of them is doing. And they said, well, what if we can make some sort of effort? So we launched a community of innovators with a singular problem. We want people to age healthier and better. And so we created a partnership between us and a number of other folks, corporates, governments, agencies, not-for-profits, to really focus on the challenges of aging and how can we look at technologies, how can we look at ideas, ideas that are very broad. So for example, could we think about housing? Because when we think about housing that's safe for folks who are getting older might also be good housing for folks who are younger. Because maybe students who want to live in an urban, expensive environment might be willing to pay a little bit less to pay if they could work with seniors and cheer up seniors as part of their workday. Maybe a couple hours of work like that would be much more interesting and better to knock down the cost of your rent than working at McDonald's. And this is not to say that there's any problem with working at McDonald's, but if you're a student getting a PhD, maybe what you'd rather do is talk to somebody else's grandma and be in an environment that's supportive for them in a human way. So not just thinking about what's an app or what's a device, but how do we make this a human community? So agencies working a number of initiatives. One of the most fascinating ones within the toolkit, as we know, entrepreneurs tend to run a little bit younger. So in Massachusetts, the age of a first-time founder is 36, and the age of a venture-backed first-time founder is 42, which, while not that young, is still quite young. There's agency as a set of empathy tools. And if any of you come visit Boston, please come call me and I'll bring you over and show them to you. There are tools that you can put on that give you the perspective of somebody who's suffering from different kinds of age-related degeneration. Maybe they walk a little bit slower, maybe it's a little bit harder to see, maybe their hands are a little bit jittery. How can somebody who has these impairments operate your device so that folks can design their tools with a bit more empathy and a bit more understanding? So we're trying to do this as we build innovation infrastructure to create the environment for folks to be more successful at building by connecting them to the resources they need. And they're building in just about every sector. So you can see about 20% of our space is life sciences, 20% is software and mobile, and then hardware and devices, service providers, and then we have very small amounts of marketing firms and education. We have a number of venture capital folks and private equity folks. So just on that venture capital number, so in the last 20 years, CIC was founded in 1999. And since 1999, we've seen a 140x increase in assets under management in Kendall Square. This is the neighborhood where 3 of our 4 Boston area buildings are. In Kendall Square, Cambridge, we've seen a tremendous growth, and more than half of that number is now based at CIC. So if you're thinking about building a startup, this is the power of concentration. If you can build the right environment for people to build their companies, then the venture capital folks follow. And for people thinking and asking about, well, why is this? Why are venture capital folks following this quickly? The reason is that venture capital likes to invest in follow-on rounds. And if you remember what I started this with, this whaling example, the way that venture capital actually succeeds is when venture capitalists bring each other into deals so they can share the risk, share the burden, but also share the rewards. And so the smart venture capitalists know this. And they know that as the company that funds the A round is not necessarily going to be the lead investor in the B round. And they're not necessarily going to be the lead investor in the C round. And so these kind of things require them to work with one another to be these co-lead investors in round after round. And this is why when you build the right ecosystem, the venture capital grows and grows and grows. By the way, this is more venture capital per capita than anywhere on Earth. So just a fun fact. A number of folks, some governors, some princes, and some scholars have said really nice things about us. We can move on past that. So this is the mayor of Boston cutting the opening ribbon for the opening of our robotics facility, and the ribbon is actually being cut by a humanoid robot. Just kind of a fun thing. And then these folks are building a giant metal spider. And this is the kind of stuff that can happen in the world of shared spaces. We can build shared spaces, but not only can we affect the robotics industry, not only can we work on kind of cool gadget toys, and not only can we have flying wind turbines, but actually we can also build environments where folks who are just starting and building their own businesses can create a common facility to build a common kitchen and share their kitchen enterprise. The reason we care about this is pretty critical. So in the US, and I'm sure this data is true globally, but we've looked at this data for the US and we've looked at this data for Australia, where the numbers are different, but the data is the same. All new job growth in the United States comes from startups. So this thing here, these are existing companies. What are existing companies currently doing? They're getting smaller. What are startups doing? They're making jobs. So if you want to think about the future of your economy, you have to invest in the creation of startups. And this is what we're trying to do, is building spaces that do this. So out of CIC, we've tracked the creation of about 40,000 innovation economy jobs coming out of CIC over the last 20 years. And I think we're going to continue seeing that grow as we grow globally. So care about this because, look, ultimately innovation is really about our future. And I want to ask you something as I'm closing up my rant. I want to ask you to do this work together. We've got to fix the world, and we can't do it alone. We have to collaborate flexibly across groups of unrelated individuals and make the world a better place because we're the only people who can. So let's do it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gaishan, for the engaging and informative presentation. Now it's time for us to work together for a Q&A session. We have about 8 to 10 minutes, more likely to be 8 minutes, to cover a couple of questions on slido.com. So we have about 3 or 4, so if you have a favorite question, or we can go in order, it's your choice.
Okay, so love it. Yeah, so let's do the first. I can do these quite specifically. So characteristics of CIC. So CIC is a shared space. We're not an accelerator. However, we host more than 20 accelerators in Boston. So everyone from the German Life Sciences Accelerator to an accelerator for Chinese companies that want to do business in the US, and a number of other both country accelerators, industry-specific accelerators like agency, that focus on agent. We really think about ourselves as the petri dish on which innovation grows. So our goal is to create the environment and then to create the community. And I didn't mention this, but 10 years ago, we started a not-for-profit called the Venture Cafe Foundation. And the Venture Cafe's goal is to connect and broaden the innovation community. So we have 200 organizational partners in Boston with whom we do all this stuff. So that's how we collaborate. We're really close friends and partners with just about everybody who's in that business. All right, second, Mass Challenge. Very close friends of ours started at CAC. The first program was run at CAC. My cousin worked there for 3 years. A lot of us are judges or partners or engaged in different ways, but they're very, very good friends of ours. Okay, what differentiates Boston from other ecosystems? I think lots. Really, one of the funny things with Boston is there's it's been around for a long time, and it's an incredibly collaborative ecosystem. It's small enough that many of us know one another, and we like one another. And that generates what I call a, pardon my French, no asshole policy. So the thing is about when you're in a small ecosystem is when somebody misbehaves, they get shut out. And so what we're able to do is we're able to use our close networks and connections to make sure that people generally behave well towards one another. Because if I find out that somebody is not a good person to work with, then I'm not going to work with them, and neither will anyone who works with me, and then neither will anyone who works with them. And then very quickly, the incentives are structured such that people act well and act nobly towards one another. And that high level of interconnectedness is very, very useful because, so I'll use Phil, who's sitting in the back of the room from the Harvard Innovation Lab. We hadn't met before today, but when he saw that I was here, he texted my colleague, who he had previously encountered as a client in our space, and said, hey, what's Stas's number? And then he texted me. And so this is the kind of close innovation network that exists in our world. We're all just one step away from one another. And what it means is when you're building your company, it's very easy to get to just about anybody you need to talk to and get advice from anybody you need to get advice from. So that's been very, very, very helpful. And I could rant for hours about Boston. Yeah, no, it's pretty cool. Yes, go Bruins. I'm really much more of a Patriots fan than a Bruins fan, but yes, go Bruins. Bruins is our hockey team, for folks who don't know. Cool deep tech startups. You really want to keep me here for hours, right? There's really, really amazing stuff happening. I'm trying to think of what's...
you have 5 minutes, so if you could take some time to think about
it. 5 minutes to explain the deep tech startups in Boston. Man, that's hard. Well, look, there's a company at MIT Engine, a fusion company, which I mentioned briefly previously. They're trying to find a way to build a small fusion reactor because they think it would be really nice if we could take water and create out of it basically infinite energy. The same infinite energy nearly infinite energy that powers the sun. If there's no such thing as actually infinite energy. I find this kind of stuff to be deeply fascinating. But I think some of the really cool stuff is not just in deep tech, but in human and humane tech. So one of my very good friends started a business-like non-for-profit. She was getting her PhD at Harvard, and she was getting her PhD in microbiology. And she found that Harvard was not disposing of its equipment, the lab equipment, in a way that she thought made sense. As Harvard upgraded to new stuff, they had enough resources, they were simply paying a company to dispose of it. And she thought, what a shame. What if we could get this to scientists who really badly need this equipment? And so she was able to start a nonprofit, convince Harvard to pay her instead of the waste company to take the equipment, and then built a partnership with scientists in the developing world who she brings the equipment to, but not as a gift, right? Because all of us will take something for free. If you say, hey, here's this thing for free, you're not going to say, wait, do I really need this thing? You're going to say, oh, free, free's good. I like free, I'll take it. And so instead of this, they charge scientists in the developing world a very small fee under the idea that people won't pay for something they don't need. So the scientists pay for this, and in exchange, they get brought to Boston to work in research labs together with university and corporate partners so that they're plugged into the global innovation economy. So when they go back, they don't only have equipment, but they have connections and collaborative partnerships with scientists so that when they apply for grants, they can have research partners not only in the developing world, but in the developed world that can help them figure out research. And that type of human and humane partnership, I think, is pretty critical. And I think the deep tech stuff is super fascinating and interesting, but some of the most interesting stuff comes out of just a better human approach and thinking about how this could work. So Oh, are we seeing interest in Boston? Yes, a ton. Boston has much more capital today than it has companies to invest in. It's because of these big global VCs have come in and said, look, there's a place where people build deep, serious tech. Boston is really known for its B2B companies. They have a lot of things in common. They're very profitable. They've been around for a while. They know how to do business. They make money, and you've probably never heard of them, like Akamai. And so there are a lot of those folks are coming in and saying, hey, I want to come to Boston. And also they're saying, hey, can I put my company in Boston? Because they're recognizing the connections between, think about this. Specifically interesting on Israel. So there are 200 Israeli companies that are in Boston that are scaling their global presence. They came from Israel, started in Boston, and then run their global team for Boston. So we have a lot of that going on.
There's one question that you missed over here. How does CIC protect startups and innovators from their ideas being stolen by enterprises or other nations?
Yeah, so it's interesting. This is a very interesting question, and it has two simple answers. One is, it's really hard to protect a product from being stolen by a country, because countries have levels of resources that individuals and companies sometimes don't. The second answer, I think, and maybe a more useful one, is, look, frankly, the most interesting challenge is not ever the product, right? For folks who build large-scale startups, what you know is that there are very few people who can actually build and scale a venture. That actually most people are not, that the skill of the entrepreneur is very, very, very difficult. And so the entrepreneur who's able to not only come up with the idea, but convince people to build their team, to grow their enterprise and scale it, that's a pretty unique talent. So most people are not, shouldn't really be afraid that somebody will steal their idea. I think the bigger challenge is, can you be the better supplier of a product to market so that you can build something that people are really excited about buying. And where we see most companies fail is not because somebody took their idea, but companies tend to fail because they haven't quite gotten the product market fit, and people aren't really interested in buying their stuff. I recognize that there's a little bit, that theft is a real concern in the world of IP, but we don't see it as a big deal for companies within CIC.
Thank you so much. I know a lot of you have a lot of questions, but as Mr. Gage had said, he has shared the email address with you, so if you have any further questions, please feel free to email him. With that, let's please give him a big hand to end the session. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.